Thank you. I'm really happy to be part of this conference as a discussant, as it is about a region of the Ottoman Empire and of Turkey that I'm not studying closely, but still the issues are quite interesting from my perspective, and I'm particularly happy to be chair discussant of this session, which is probably for me the saddest in terms of title. It's Anatolia's Religious Heritage as Abandoned Spaces. We shall begin with the first presentation by Assistant Professor Veysel, Dr. Veysel Dinler, who is a graduate from the Police Academy at Near East University Faculty of Law, who has a doctorate in public administration from the Süleyman Demirel University, and who is currently member of faculty at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Hitit University, who is teaching primarily in the field of public law. But I'm particularly happy to see that someone, while doing police service, would notice the abandoned holy places. The floor is yours, Dr. Dinler.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Değerli dinleyiciler, hepinize iyi günler diliyorum.
Thank you very much. I would like to greet you with respect, and I would like to wish you a nice afternoon. This abandoned and forgotten worship places will be the topic of my presentation, and I will be talking about not a conversion from a space of worship from one religion to the other, but I will at the same time talk about abandonment, which results in a waste place. And in today's presentation, I will deal with this. What is the point of start for this presentation? While I was a young member of the police service in Sparta, there was an abandoned church which was still living. However, as there was no worship, there was no periodical maintenance or cleaning up. That's why it was seen as an abandoned space where drug addicts were visiting and different criminals were there coming from time to time. And the paint has faded away. There were different things written on the wall, and this was seen a potential spot for crime. And when in a society where 99% of the population is Muslim, if there are no Christians around, what is the use of this building if drug dealers and other small gangs live in the space? Let us have it demolished. This is the mindset. For irritated neighbors, you can think that this is right, or for individuals who have increased workload because of this place, police might have a similar approach. Let's demolish this, let's get rid of this, then we will be saved. This might be the attitude. However, when I have a look back, this is the building I'm talking about. And this is the Hagia Banya Church, and this is the Hagia Georgi Church. These are the two churches that I have been talking about. And another reason here is that this is something that I have not identified despite passing by several times. It is at Çorum Center. This was constructed in 1870s. This was an Armenian church, which I learned later. And nobody knows about this at the moment. These are very newly taken photos. You see the door, you see the silhouette here. And there are no real signs that will tell us that this is a church. Around it, as you might see, there are signs of other store owners, and their left belongings outside the building. And I then decided to talk about this topic at this very conference and prepared a presentation. How are places of worship converted and how are they forgotten? I decided to focus on the topic from 3 dimensions. One is complete destruction. One center of worship or a place of worship, its traces are completely destructed. And the second one is becoming a waste due to lack of maintenance, not having periodical repairs. And the third one is it's becoming a private property and it's being used out of purpose. So it might have been covered in Hagia Sophia or in other mosques, or the conversion of churches and synagogues to mosques. I won't be talking about those dimensions. I will be mostly talking about abandonment and destruction. When I say complete destruction, what is this? Together with the start of the Republican era, the cultural fabric of Anatolia changed significantly. 1/3 of the population at the time was Christians in those days, in the confines of Anatolia, and with different settlement policies and interventions, the cultural fabric changed significantly. We are talking about a society which has recently left a war, and we are then confronted with the Second World War, and this means the first 50 years of the 20th century is mainly wars, and there is a rising notion of nationalism. This is not only a problem for Turkey, but seen in other areas of the world. And national identity, nationalism, as it is seen elsewhere, it is also significant in Turkey. In the nation identity, we see the geography that is getting Muslim, that is freeing itself from Christian elements at the same time. And we are not people who attach importance to archaeological finds. When we were kids, we were told that Germans stole the pieces found in Bergamo Museum. When you go to the museum, there is nothing left to steal. And then we are told another story, which is that these are put to limestone fire pits, and which shows us that the environment is amenable for destruction. So there is a wish for treasure hunting as well. There are urban legends about Armenian treasures, and people want to get hold of these, and whether it be private places, churches, or others, they are easily destructed and demolished. And also, there is a bad municipality service that needs to be covered, especially during Menderes regime, when mosques from Ottoman times are considered. There is a thought process that destructs the mosques. If they can do it, they can easily demolish the churches, and you can understand this mentality. In the rural area, there are abundant cemeteries which are used for agricultural activities by the villagers. This is also a fact. There is Akise and Karakise, for example. There were places called White Church and Black Church, so they were converted into agricultural land in Sungurlu and in other villages. It is possible to hear about this. And there are news which are very ordinary that you might see in Turkey. You see an Armenian cemetery being destructed by machinery, and you see human bones being found on the ground. There are many, many examples, but I won't be talking about this. In our country, there is an attraction to flat stones. Why do I show you this slide? If you pay attention, the stones and the foundation stones are taken from the Çorum castle, maybe from the destructed portions. Whether it be synagogues, churches, or other places of worship. Once these are abandoned, these become construction material for certain villagers. You sometimes go to a village, you might see some foundational elements which used to belong to a church in a house. And it is possible to see this easily. That's why I have this photo here. So we are told that there are more than 500,000 treasure hunters. And on one TV show, on one of the national channels, there was an individual who talked about Armenian and Greek remnants. And it is as if this individual was promoting theft and praising it. And it happened during a live performance. Maybe some of the participants might remember. And because of not having any maintenance, turning into a waste is also a problem. Why isn't there any maintenance here? This might be linked to three elements. One is lack of will. So what I mean is there are reasons completely unrelated to religion. It doesn't reflect anything related to religion. And we know the situation for İshak Pasha Palace, for example. And there are things contrary to the spirit of restoration, whether it be synagogues, churches. These are not properly maintained and periodical repairs do not take place. And it is not easy to perform this in Turkey. And I'm not saying this for the sake of hamaset. And there are tax laws, capital tax law, you know, and the pogrom of 1955 on the 6th and 7th of September. These are the concrete indicators of unwillingness. And talking about these even shows us the unwillingness to repair these places. I will relate this to shattered glass theory, and I will tell you why this happens, and the chaotic authority situation in Turkey and bureaucracy is also the culprit, and we have to talk about these as well. So let's talk about the broken windows theory. This depends on an experiment, social experiment by Philip Zimbardo. If you do not repair the broken glass, it is inevitable that the other windows of the building will be broken. He leaves a car in front of a building, and after a while, the glasses are gone, then there is nothing left from the car. If there is no owner, then you cannot claim any responsibility for the building. You see that the glasses are broken in a short while and the space becomes a waste. And after Zimbardo, Wilson and Kelling developed the broken windows theory in an attempt to explain vandalism in criminology. Yet, as we talk about abandoned places of worship, this will be a very valid argument. So these are, as I said, very recent photos of the churches in Isparta. You cannot identify if a stone is taken out or not, because most of the building itself is in very bad shape. You see the paint not being properly there. So this broken glass theory is damaging and distracting these buildings. And these are very striking findings. And let's now talk about conflict of authority. The preservation of old buildings in Turkey is based on law number 2863. Under this, we have numerous regulations. There is the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, Ministry of Environment and Urbanization, Ministry of Interior Affairs, governorships, provincial administrations, municipalities, foundations, and private property owners in the process taking a role. And among all of these, there is a conflict of authority. And of course, there is a stagnant bureaucracy. These repairs are being conducted by conservation, implementation, and inspection offices. Among the individuals who are engaged in the effort, we have art historians, architects, city planning experts, civil engineers, archaeologists. This is a long and expensive method linked to detailed regulations. And as I said, the bureaucracy in Turkey makes the process slow down further. As I said, there is unwillingness, which is part of the process, but in such a bureaucratic structure, whether even if the will is there, it is not possible to have them performed. So now we see the contribution of Isparta municipality to the maintenance of these buildings. You see the roofs being repaired. The point I want to emphasize here is that it says there is municipalities' contribution to tourism and science. Nobody mentions the fact that these places were places of worship in the past. And imagine that you are in your apartment. Even in your apartment, you are meticulous in keeping it clean, and a place of worship, on the other hand, is valuable for many people, but there is no mentioning of this dimension. But as a start, this is something good still. In Eridir, in Ayastefanos Church, there was a restoration effort with the participation of the counterparts from Greece. And 2 years ago, there was worship that took place, which is good news. However, opening it to worship is through financial contributions of people who live in Greece. Another topic, let's come to this, which is private property. In Çorum, Sırf Georg Church, in Sungurlu, this is another spot which used to be a church, which is now listed as private property and shown as a house. And these are the photos of the place in Sungurlu. So how were these converted into private properties? In the municipalities law dated 1930, the abandoned cemeteries and the public cemeteries that belong to foundations have been transferred to the municipalities. And in the land registry law dated 1934, in a similar manner, we see that abandoned and homeless cemeteries in villages and public cemeteries belonging to the foundations are registered in the name of the legal personality of the village. That's how these are opened for agriculture. And these type of news are easily found on the newspapers lately. And this is a church for sale from the owner. So it is possible to see these as ads on newspapers. There was a famous journalist in Turkey and talking about the villages and churches owned by his grandfather. And he said if he's paid enough, he would transfer these because the deeds are on the grandfather and he inherited these, he said. So it is possible to see such examples. And Çorum Surp Church, estimated to be built in 1872. And in Çorum, nobody calls it with this name. And Kaan Köksal is an architect. And after a detailed search, an article is written saying that this is Surp Church. And it was for long years used as a carpentry shop and then used as a warehouse after being sold. The good news is that it is now in the hands of the municipality to be used for more cultural purposes. And nobody even knows its name. Its name is even forgotten, which is in itself an abandonment. In conclusion, Turkey does not give enough value to these buildings. There is unwillingness, insufficient budget, stagnant bureaucracy, the disease of treasure hunting, and ambition to make money. All of the above work together for abandonment of these buildings. We want to raise awareness about these buildings in order for them to be made best use of. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dinler. Now we
Teşekkürler
move
Doktor Dinler.
eastward
Şimdi biraz daha
and
doğuya doğru
from
gidiyoruz
a paper which
ve
touched upon Greek and Armenian churches, we are now focusing on the area of Van and the Armenian heritage. Our next speaker is Mr. Mehmet Fatih Güden from the Van University, who has also an interesting career from the Electrical and Electronics department at the vocational school of the university, moving to its Department of Art History and focusing now on, in his master thesis on the Christian religious architecture in the Gürpınar district of Van, who has already produced also a 60-minute documentary called Silent Bells, which is quite a telling title for the topic that we will be listening about. The floor is yours, Mr. Güden.
Thank you. Merhabalar. Öncelikle
hello, good afternoon. I would first of all like to welcome you all to my presentation. It is indeed my pleasure to be involved in such an important event. I would like to express my gratitude to the organizer, ADİP, Anatolian Religions and Beliefs Platform. I completed my undergraduate education at the Department of Art History at Van University. I'm currently doing my master's thesis on the subject of Christian religious architecture in Gürpınar district of Van. For nearly 10 years, I've been conducting field studies on a voluntary basis to create archives and inventory in Lake Van Basin, which is in danger. Actually, there are security problems. It is giving me great pleasure. I feel myself quite fortunate because the geography I live in is indeed one of the most special parts of the country. Since my time is limited today, I will be focusing on a specific part of one, because most of the information you would have access to in the documents, but instead I will be focusing on a certain part. Most of these places have been transformed as places of worship. Hopefully, I will have a fruitful 20-minute session. Welcome once again. Once upon a time, used to be the informal capital of Armenians. Before 1915, in a book called Armenians During the Ottoman Empire, 1878, statistical information, the Patriarchy records would show 57 monasteries. Unfortunately, only a few of them are surviving. In today's world, when we take a look at the ancient heritage, systematic research and accumulation of knowledge is rather limited. Along with this, when we take a look at Lake Van Basin, we see that unfortunately it's in a deep silence. In the normalization process, the Holy Cross Monastery and Ahtamar have been renovated. Although these are regarded to be positive steps, this restoration attracted the attention to Ahtamar, and tens of other cultural heritage monuments have been somehow neglected. In one region, we see many monuments, monasteries, and churches that have gone silent. When we consider this fact, we can say that this command is rightful. Since 1915, the tangible heritage and assets, historical assets, in order to feel and see these monuments, unfortunately, not much effort has been spent. If we are to touch upon the cultural heritage, there are some which have been subject to treasure hunting, and there are some subject to being used for other purposes, such as barns. You may even Google and see it yourself. Especially in areas where there is security surveillance, we know that there are many undiscovered monasteries. There are some monasteries, historical monuments and monasteries, that are included in the special security zones, and unfortunately it is not known what the conditions are. Regarding the relationship, although the issue is known on a global scale, the social framework is always handled within the context of genocide. And people living in this region, social dimension has been neglected and not much has been done. So in this sense, the protection, preservation of historical and cultural sites and seeing monuments of cultural heritage, these should be seen as milestones of collective memory, and steps have to be taken accordingly. In order to preserve and conserve these monuments, there should be a macro level step, and it requires political will. But then again, instead of waiting for such a political will, there are some steps that may be taken at the grassroots level. Under current conditions, the values and assets and risks that these monuments are confronted with, there should be an awareness. Before I proceed with the visuals of my presentation, I would like to share with you a couple of things based on my experience. Well, according to the field study that I conducted, especially in the rural areas, the perspective of the community is towards treasure hunting. So when there is a monastery or a church near a settlement, most of the time people settled in that specific part of the country have a tendency. It may sound like blaming these people, but this is something that I have personally observed myself many times. In the rural settlements, when we take a look at the monuments, we see that they have survived because they still serve for a purpose. In brief, what I encountered, what I observed so far is that most of the monuments within the settlements are used either as barns or warehouses for hay. In some settlements, we see monasteries and churches which are sometimes consciously or unconsciously used. Materials, construction materials are taken away by the settlers and used for other purposes. So in some faraway, remote areas, some of the buildings, churches and monuments are left to the mercy of the nature, and some are, as I've said, within the security zone, so their conditions, current conditions, are not known. In addition to this, in some churches and some monasteries, there are some attempts to make some restoration. For instance, 7 churches, the monastery, for many years, the guard is doing his best to protect this, preserve this monument along with his family. And there's another monastery, again, taken under protection by the village headman. In order to enable that, the local people have to be given an awareness, and such projects would carry a significant importance. I would now like to share with you some visuals. This is Hokyat Der Meryem Monastery. This is in Van, Gürpınar district. This is known by the academic circles, and many research activities have been conducted. But for many years, because of the military operations undertaken here, access to this monastery is difficult and challenging. For the last 3 years, I've been trying to get the permit to travel there, and I still couldn't. This is in the southern part of Gürpınar, Van, and in Northern Valley. According to oral history, it's not concrete, but according to oral history, well-known king and queen's tombstones are here. It was used for hospital purposes at some point. And this monastery was used for and by ladies for a certain period of time. This is information I derived back in 2015 from a website. However, in a document dated 750, the apostles brought an icon of Mother Mary and stored it here. So the date goes back to the 8th or 9th century. Academic research has been conducted by my professor Yalçın Karaca, who is at the same time my advisor for my dissertation thesis. This is a monastery composed of 22 chambers, and it was quite glorious. This was before it was demolished. Let me share with you an anecdote. In the surrounding villages, Muslim couples, after getting married, would visit this monastery on Sundays and would sacrifice hand. And once they get a baby, especially if it's a girl, they name the girl after Mary. This is a bit of information I learned quite recently from the old man. For a very long time, this monastery survived. However, as the Armenians left the monastery, 2 Kurdish families settled in here, led their lives here, and then because of a dispute related to land, they had a conflict between the 2 families, and then someone lost his life, and then the monastery was abandoned. And then after 1960s, it became subject to the Lloyd of treasure hunters. I had paid a visit back a few years ago when there was the peace process, and those were the visuals I had taken. An interior, a photograph focusing on the interior. This is again the church, the main hall. This is from the front facade. And let me continue with the next structure. And this structure is from Van Bahçesaray Çatbayır village. Çatbayır is also known as Çat village in Bahçesaray, Van. And this is a part of a private, this is on a private land. Since there is no academic work conducted on this church, we are unable to date it. However, the arch structure that you see, when compared with other examples, indicate that the construction must have been dated back to the 13th, 14th century. As I paid a visit to this church, I saw a hall. I got some permission from the landowner, and when I went into the church, in one of the halls, I realized a tablet, which I think is about the background of the construction. I found this by coincidence. I contacted one museum, but I don't know whether anyone got interested. If this tablet is analyzed, I'm sure specific dates could be brought into daylight. This building is used as a warehouse. That's why it survived to this day. Next structure is again from one of the rural parts of Van. This is from Chilga village. Çiçan is the Armenian name, and Çiçan is the Kurdish name given to this village. When compared with other Armenian churches, this has a different structure. This is the Çiçan village. This looks from the exterior. And this church, when I made some scanning and research, I saw no academic research conducted, so I'm unable to date the church. However, my advisor, again, had conducted a search and says that this church dates back to the 17th and 18th century. Again, according to Sevan Nişanyan Maps, it's a website prepared by Sevan Nişanyan. According to a different resource on that website, it dates back to the 7th century sources saying that part of the authentic cross was stolen and brought here, and in one of the deep valleys this was found, and it is at a very difficult point to reach, and along the valley in the rural area 2 more monasteries were erected, and again this Chilga village church was used as a barn by the villagers for a very long period of time. When I went there to take a picture, this was actually what I saw. It had been demolished, the entrance. Next example is Van Gevaş Dönemenç village, Atlazaddin church. This was again in a village in Van Gevaş. It was subject to the activities of the treasure hunters, and it was significantly demolished. No academic work on this church, so we are unable to date the exact construction year. A couple of visuals I'd like to share with you. Yeah, you see Artos Mountain in the background and Dönemeç village church. And this one is this church, this structure is again included in my dissertation thesis. This is Gürpınar Erkaldı village. Kınaslan is the name, and this is the church in the village. This village church has been demolished and a brand new construction was made. 10 years ago, when I paid a visit, I saw that the semi-structure had still survived, but I suppose by now it's only a rock that's left. This bit that you see in the picture, unfortunately, the villagers exaggerated and overdid reconstruction work, and this was the entrance to the church. From Here we see again another example from Yedisalkın Put village church in Gürpınar. It was converted into a house for the village headman. Here you see the access section of the church when you enter through here. Again, on Nişanyan maps, I could find some details, no academic work other than that. According to this website, Put village dated back to the 9th century, and by the 12th century it had been harmed. This is Yavuzlar Taik is the Armenian name. Yavuzlar village rock chapel. I think it's only me knowing this area. It looked like the formation in Cappadocia. That's why it's called Vanadocia. On the right-hand side, the rock has been converted into a chapel as a cave was formed, and I discovered this by chance, by coincidence. I didn't see any reference in the academic papers. This chapel, again, near this chapel, there is a monastery kind of structure close to this chapel. Let me show you the details. This is the entrance. And there's a small niche, and it's like a small place of worship and also shelter. And this is Taik village church, again in Başkale, Yavuzlar village in Van. And according to the search I conducted in the academic resources, I could see no reference. This is the apsis. I think you can see it from the photograph. This is 200 meters from the chapel that you have just seen. Yes, as you can see, this is again from Van Başkale. It's called Vanadocia. And this is Bahçesaray Papatya village church. Through the deep valleys, you reach here. Transportation or commuting here is extremely difficult. We had gone there to make some measurements. Again, we had discovered it by pure chance during the field study. That was the entrance you just saw. And this is an Armenian cross. So this structure, again, is used as a warehouse for hay by the villagers. Again, one of the forgotten place of worship. From here, most of the structures that I will be talking about are structures that are already available in the academic resources. I would like to share some visuals before I conclude. This is on Çarpanak Island, Gudut Anabat Monastery. From the value and significance perspective, this is nothing inferior than Akdamar Church, and this is Muradiye Surpi Stepanos Monastery. It is at an elevation of 2,000 meters, looking over Muradiye. Because of treasure hunting, it used to be a monastery, and only the main hall of the church had survived. This is Başkale Albayrak village, Surp Bartolomeos Monastery, quite glorious, and both from the architectural perspective and from the plan features perspective, it's quite precious, but it is about to be in ruins. This is the southern shores of one lake. The reason why I show this picture is that all Van, Tatvan, Reşadiye, all that region, there are 16, 17 monasteries that are partly surviving. And from here, I'd like to show a couple of more examples. For instance, this is Surp Harutyun Monastery. It is on the tip of a peninsula. It's at a very good point. You can only have access here with a boat. This is Gevaş Garmir Ağa'nın Garmravang Monastery. It's called red church, again on the southern shores of one lake, and it is at the tip of at the bottom of a deep valley. Again, another example from Gevaş, southern shores of one lake. Gevaş Surp Thomas Monastery, built on plateau of 2,000 meters, and it dates back to the 15th century, most probably. Finally, regarding these structures, I can talk about the documentary we prepared. Silent Bells is the name of the documentary. It has been shared at various festivals. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Günden, for taking me back to Van, where I was 10 years ago, and I loved the monuments, some of the monuments you showed. Very sad story anyway. Now we move to yet another sad story that we shall hear about. That is the presentation of Dr. Nicholas Alculu from Kadir Has University, who is specialist with the doctoral dissertation at the University of Sydney on the socio-cultural history and heritage of Assyrians in Iran, but who has worked also on the larger area on Assyrians and with the inscriptions in Syriac and Neo-Aramaic, who is currently working as an English language instructor at Kadir Has, but continues his research on Syriac and Assyrians. The floor is yours, Dr. Arif.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Now, for nearly 15 centuries, the rugged highlands of Hakkari have served as a cradle of Syriac Christianity and a refuge for adherents of the Church of the East, from where they could protect themselves from persecution. The mountain stronghold, for example, of Kochanes, served as the patriarchate of this church, and from there, its Catholicos patriarchs served as both the spiritual and temporal leaders of the region's semi-independent Assyrian tribes. This situation, however, was ended entirely with their expulsion, first to Iran by the Ottoman Empire in 1915, and finally to Iraq by the Turkish Republic in 1924. With this, some 264 churches, monasteries, chapels, and shrines within the current boundaries of Hakkari province alone were left behind to their fate. After providing a background, this paper will go through the current state of affairs, attempts at finding solutions, and possible options available to all stakeholders involved. So the Assyrians have a history in Hakkari going back to the pre-Christian era, when their ancestors' once powerful empire used the area as a buffer zone between it and the kingdom of Urartu. Indeed, the very name of the region is believed to derive from the Akkadian Ikkari, or Aramaic Akkare, meaning farmers. Much of the current Hakkari province appears to have been governed by the late antique Assyrian kingdom of Adiabene, based at Erbil in current-day Iraq, and it was during this period in which we observed the beginnings of Christianity's spread there. While Syriac literary traditions relate to the apostolic evangelization of Hakkari, the oldest known churches in the province are believed to have been established between the 4th and 6th centuries. The majority of the Assyrians, or the Christians that lived in Hakkari, adhered to the Church of the East, also known as the Nestorian Church, with a minority that belonged to the Chaldean Catholic and Protestant splinter groups formed as a result of Western missionary activities beginning in the 19th century. and the Catholics had about 14 churches in Hakkari, the Protestants about 5 respectively. In general, the churches of Hakkari are mostly built using uncut stones, very similar to some of the mountain Armenian churches shown by the previous speaker. And they bear little in the way of ornamentation or external architectural features, such as belfries. With their flat roofs and straight walls, they are usually plain cubes of masonry from the exterior, while the dark vaulted interiors were often plastered. The functional simplicity of these buildings, however, highlights the poverty and piety of those who built them, as well as the ruggedness of their geographical setting, with thick walls and loophole windows to keep out the bitter winter cold. These are not vain monuments of grandeur or greatness, and nothing about them was meant to distract worshippers from the focus for which they were to be used, namely, prayer and contemplation of the divine. All attention was directed to the sanctuary area, where the sacred liturgy was conducted, and the vaulted ceilings provided natural acoustics which amplified the sounds of the chants. Even the entrances of these churches were deliberately made low and narrow in order to force those entering to bow in reverence. Finally, in some cases, these churches may additionally bear carved designs of artistic significance or inscriptions of historical importance, the loss of which would also be one for local and world heritage. So, since the dispossession of the Assyrians and the subsequent abandonment of their places of worship in Hakkari, these have undergone various stages of desecration and repurposing. Travelers to the area between the 1960s and 1980s noted that many of them were being used as stables or for storage. Often, whether or not a church has been completely destroyed further depends on its geographical location. The Kurdish tribe settled around it, and also the material it was built from. For instance, in the easily accessible areas with large populations, such as the plain of Gawar or Yuksekova, where many of the churches were built of mud brick, most of them have been destroyed completely. Moreover, churches have been deliberately neglected or purposely destroyed in areas where the Kurdish tribes are particularly religious Muslims, or where they were historic enemies of the Assyrians. In places inhabited by tribes which were settled in Hakkari from other areas during the 1940s, many of the churches have been reused for storage, as stables, or simply abandoned. In most of these cases, the repurposing of these churches has ironically resulted in their preservation from destruction. On the other hand, the least amount of damage to churches is found in villages inhabited by Kurds who either belonged to Assyrian tribes, had friendly relations with Assyrians, or have distant kinship relations with them. In some cases, churches were destroyed to build infrastructure such as roads or dams, or replaced with military bases, since they were often built in prominent and easily defensible locations. This is because the Assyrians often used churches as places of refuge during times of persecution or when they were under attack from the surrounding tribes. In other cases, villagers consulted indicated outside influences as the reason for which the churches were destroyed, whether this was encouraged by commanders from adjacent military bases or ordered by imams sent by the State Directorate of Religious Affairs. Since the eruption of hostilities between Kurdish rebels and the Turkish government in 1984, many areas in the Hakkari province have become war zones. Evacuated villages have served as camps and hideouts for anti-government guerrillas, which has resulted in them being bombed by the military. In at least one case, according to my interlocutors in Iran, an important Assyrian monastic church on the border, which you see in this picture, was ruined in this manner. It is not known how many other religious structures have shared the same fate. While there was a brief respite between 2013 and 2015, when a peace process was in place, the political situation is currently still very tense and unpredictable. Besides, in the last 20 years, the trend has been toward outright and wanton damage and destruction through the banal phenomenon of treasure hunting, which has already been described. This, however, is not something unique to Turkey. I first witnessed its effects in the Urmia region of Iran in 2002, where churches and graves were regularly excavated and gravestones smashed in a vain quest to find gold or valuable artifacts. According to local legends, Christian Armenians and Assyrians were more hardworking and wealthier than their Muslim neighbors, who for the most part were Kurds, and that they buried their wealth in their churches and cemeteries before fleeing their homes during the First World War, rather than taking it with them to support themselves, which would be more logical. This racist narrative ignores the fact that in many areas, the Christians were indigenous, long-settled peoples descended from ancient civilizations, unlike the Kurds who began to immigrate to their areas during the Middle Ages, first as nomadic tribes, surviving on animal herding and brigandage. Nevertheless, it also disregards the fact that most rural Christians lived in extreme poverty and were often prey to the deprivations of neighboring Kurdish tribal landlords who routinely overtaxed or plundered them. Furthermore, there is an entire support network of web pages and forums for aspiring treasure hunters, where photos of supposed finds and potential sites are posted, as well as tips on how to conduct this illegal activity. Particularly disturbing are guides which detail different types of crosses or isharets, signs, or designs as indicators of what kind of treasure must be buried under them or hidden in the walls behind them. Inscriptions and graffiti are particularly viewed as indicators of some type of treasure, making them first pickings for destruction. This has also given rise to the proliferation of fake manuscripts and artifacts, as well as treasure maps, complete with writing in bogus languages. Unfortunately, the above-mentioned websites are not policed or taken offline, and many of the criminals continue their vandalism unobstructed and without any fear of being punished. Thus, we observe that this hunt in vain for fabled treasure is not solely limited to extreme cases of excavation, which compromise the foundations of such vulnerable and abandoned buildings, but they also extend to the removal of stones from the structures themselves, which can result in their collapse. Moreover, and what is often found includes liturgical objects and manuscripts which were hidden for safety, and these lose their value since they are removed from their archaeological and historical contexts. And this has rendered the Christian Assyrian heritage of Hakkari particularly vulnerable to being lost forever. So a little bit about the current situation and the importance of action. Out of the 64 potential Assyrian religious structures or sacred sites abandoned within the Hakkari province alone, roughly 105 have been securely located, photographed, or studied, so less than half, whether by myself, notwithstanding my own limitations, other scholars, or local informants. Of these, 53 lie empty and abandoned in various stages of structural decline, as you can see with these before and after pictures, with 21 significantly ruined or collapsed. A further 14 have been ruined to their foundations. So this is one that's been abandoned that's in good shape. So these are in various stages of collapse and destruction. A further 14 have been ruined to their foundations or require archaeological excavation. A total of 5 churches are now being used as storage, one of which is within a military base. And in one of these cases, a former patriarchal residence on top of it has become a private dwelling. Moreover, 30 churches no longer exist, and their foundations can no longer be seen. 4 of these were destroyed to build military bases, 1 to build a road, another to build a mosque on its site, 1 to build a stable, which you see in this picture, while yet another was ruined by a natural rockfall. Stones from churches have also been removed completely to build houses in 3 cases. fence walls in 2 cases, a mosque in 1 case, a dam in another case, and a school in yet another. In at least 3 cases, churches have been repurposed as mosques. A comprehensive scholarly survey and search for what remains of the Assyrian or Christian heritage of Hakkari is yet to be undertaken. Unfortunately, many of the sites in question are difficult to access. I mean, one of them, you might be able to see it just here up in the cave. So it needs to be climbed to, right? So they're difficult to access due to lack of roads, the sheer distances involved in many cases, as well as them being located in places requiring some amount of trekking or climbing. Another factor is hostility or lack of cooperation by some local Kurds who, for many reasons, may not want the history of their villages as previous inhabitants to be brought to light. In addition, they may not want to be exposed for destroying national heritage monuments, or they might be wary of treasure hunters. Finally, many of them may be located within restricted military areas, which are no-go zones, due to the security situation in the region. Therefore, the cooperation of a number of stakeholders, including local, administrative, and military authorities, scholars from Hakkari's university, as well as villagers, must be secured in order for such a survey to be successful. Now, a little bit about stakeholders. Without a valid official presence in Turkey since 1924, the Church of the East, the major stakeholder, is currently unable to do much in the way of legally contesting the current state of its former properties and historical cultural patrimony, or working on an international agreement for their preservation. While a handful of Turkish citizens still identify as adherents of this church, there aren't enough for a viable congregation because they are scattered, and many of them live between Turkey and the diaspora. In light of this, more established sister churches, such as the Syriac Orthodox and Chaldean Catholics, have offered to step in on their behalf to act as guarantors of these properties or manage them under their own religious community foundations, Cemaat Vakıfları. Such options, however, have not been seriously explored. In 2014, however, and on the initiative of then Member of Parliament Mr. Erol Dora, pictured here, the then Metropolitan of Iraq, Margi Vargas Sliwa, traveled to Hakkari and Ankara in order to visit some church sites and discuss the issue of their preservation and restoration with both provincial and national authorities. After his consecration as Catholicos Patriarch the following year, however, and due to issues relating to his failing health, not much more progress has been made on the church's part, unfortunately. At any rate, due to the unresolved conflict between the government and Kurdish rebels, the country's cultural and tourism ministry has heretofore been reluctant to authorize or significantly contribute to any restoration campaigns for threatened Christian places of worship in Hakkari, citing that they are in war zones and such efforts would be wasted in the end. There is also a fear that these may be used for the purpose of Christian proselytization among the local Muslims. This unfortunately leaves us with a much reduced pool of options to choose from in terms of seeking a plan of action. Nevertheless, the restoration of churches and monasteries in Hakkari, even without any local congregation, would make a serious contribution to the local tourism industry by providing interesting historical and cultural heritage sites for people to visit and learn about. It would also encourage faith and ancestry tourism from the diaspora, contributing to the local economy, and would open the possibility of dialogue and reconciliation between Turkey and the stateless Assyrian people. An increase in tourism could additionally result in the possibility of a reduction of hostilities in the region. Now, coming to my conclusions. Undoubtedly, the current situation of Hakkari's Assyrian religious heritage is unmistakably dire. If something is not done to preserve what remains, the entire memory of the region's Assyrians and their historical contributions to it will be lost forever. The first step would be to discover if there was ever a Nestorian religious community foundation registered in the Ottoman Empire prior to 1915, and whether or not it could be revived. Otherwise, the church can apply to open a branch in Turkey as a charitable foundation. Either of these would serve as a representative body for the Church of the East in Turkey in order for it to maintain its legacy in Hakkari and other provinces. Once this is achieved, the church could apply for the return of selected properties and cooperate with local cultural authorities to have them cleaned, restored, and open for tourism. For Hakkari, for instance, the relevant authorities are currently the Museum and Regional Monuments Conservation Board in Van. Currently, I am engaged in a project under the direction of Mardin Museum to clean and restore 2 Assyrian churches in the Uludere district of Şırnak province adjacent to Hakkari. Both are planned to be put on the provincial tourist route, and importantly, the local inhabitants have shown tremendous support and encouragement for this to occur. Additionally, the churches are both properties of the Turkish National Treasury, which could make their transfer back to the ownership of the Assyrian Church of the East a much smoother process. If successful, this would be a good precedent which could be repeated for a number of churches in Hakkari and other provinces. Hopefully, in this way, we can save much of what remains for future generations to admire and study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Avcıoğlu. You exceeded a bit your time limit. I would ask our next and last speaker to abide by the rules of the conference. And our last paper for the session is presented by Associate Professor Birgül Açıkyıldız, who has received her BA and MA degrees in art history at Hacettepe University in Turkey, and has proceeded with a career in mainly Europe with a DEA and PhD at Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne University, then with postdoc at Khalili Research Center at the University of Oxford at Agahan, and research fellow at Harvard University, having taught at various places. Today she is a research associate at the University of Paul Valéry at Montpellier 3, and is a researcher at French Anatolian Research Institute in Istanbul. She is also the author of a book on the Yazidis, and will talk today on the Yazidis, destruction, reconstruction, and identity. The floor is yours, Dr. Açıkyıldız.
Thank you very much, Professor GRADEVA, for your kind introduction. I would like to also express my sincere appreciation to the organizing committee to organize such an important conference and inviting me to give this paper. I would like to contribute to this conference with my paper on the Yazidi community who were exposed to massacres, slaughters, and deportations throughout their history. In this paper, I would like to begin by giving some background to the Yazidi people and their religion, and then I will discuss how the Yazidis react to exist in their homelands that they do not live anymore. I will focus on the Hasan Beg Cemetery, which is located in Nusaybin, southeastern Turkey, where Yazidis of Germany continue to bury their departed. In this presentation, I will also examine the relationship between the cemetery and Yazidi identity. I will question how the Yazidi identity reconstructs and transforms itself into monumental funerary architecture. The Yazidis are a Kurdish ethno-religious community of the Middle East and southern Transcaucasia who are monotheist and have a unique religious belief system. The Yazidis inherited various cultural and religious beliefs, and the form of each influence remained visible. Thus, a syncretic belief system and a new religion with its dogmas and rules were established. There is no liturgical or historical writing before the 12th century that could facilitate the examination of the periods of influence and the formation of Yazidism. However, contemporary religious practices and hymns that were transmitted orally over generations hint at various layers of development. Yazidism is mainly an ancient Iranian religion, which was mixed with the Sufi Islamic teaching of Sheikh Hadi in the 12th century. However, this syncretistic belief definitively distanced the religion of Sheikh Hadi's followers from Orthodox Islam after the death of Sheikh Hadi in 1162, and Yazidism is represented as a religion distinctly different from Islam. The Yazidis believe in one eternal God, which is called in Kurdish Hude, who is the creator of the universe. He is good and owner of every movement and sensation on earth. The Yazidis consider the sun, stars, fire, water, and earth as sacred. Pray in the direction of the sun, use fire on every ceremonial occasion, and believe in reincarnation. The Yazidis have a caste system and perform the rite of baptism. All these rituals point to the likelihood of pre-Islamic ancient Iranian religious roots of Yazidism. According to the Yazidi belief system, God has delegated his earthly powers to 7 angels, led by the peacock angel, who is responsible for human and worldly affairs. In the Yazidi belief, this angel is the mediator between God and Yazidi people. It leads directly to God and is not in opposition, but is an independent entity. It is the manifestation of the Creator, but not the Creator himself. Thus, the Yazidis pray to God through his statuettes in the form of the peacock. However, the Yazidis' veneration of the peacock angel and its association with the devil or Iblis in Muslim and Christian sources have led others to label them devil worshippers, and thus infidels and impure. Because of this association, the Yazidis were vulnerable to the effects of the crimes and massacres throughout their history. Moreover, Yazidism is not recognized by the Muslims as a religion of a book, and thus it is not protected under Islamic law with the status of Zimmi, like Christianity and Judaism, rendering Yazidis constantly exposed to attacks by Islamist radicals. Besides, Yazidism was considered to be a Muslim heresy by the medieval Kurdish and Arab Islamic scholars, who argued that they had deviated from a right path. Therefore, Yazidis are considered to be apostates and renegades who must be eliminated or converted to Islam under threat of persecution or massacre. Yazidi ethnic belonging also contributes to their vulnerability. Therefore, radical movements have targeted Yazidis as Kurds. Yazidism was embraced by the Kurdish tribes and dynasties. It spread to wherever the Kurds were living in the Middle East. However, their power declined from the 15th century onwards because of the oppression and massacres committed by their Muslim neighbors. Some Yazidi dynasties, such as Mahmudis of Khoshab and Bohtis of Jazrat-i Omar, converted to Islam between the 14th and 16th centuries for political reasons. Paradoxically, the Yazidis suffered principally at the hands of the Muslim Kurds. However, they continued to survive as small groups dispersed amongst the Kurds in a large area. Lalish in northern Iraq continued to be the center of Yazidism until today. At the beginning of the 20th century, Yazidis' territory remained within the frontiers of countries, namely Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Armenia, and Georgia. Thereby, they continued to live within the frame that each country established with its minorities. In the limited scope of this paper, I shall only deal with the Yazidis of Turkey. However, I shall also give some additional information to explain the Yazidis and their situation in other parts of the Middle East. Because of the country's severe attitude to its minorities, the Yazidis have faced pressure due to their ethnic and religious identity in Turkish Republic era. From the 1960s, the Yazidi community, whose population already highly reduced, began to immigrate as immigrant labor to European countries, especially to Germany, that was provoked by political and religious oppression and economic difficulties. Then the Yazidis continued to immigrate to Germany as asylum seekers. Another massive influx of Yazidis from Turkey to Germany was caused by the military coup in Turkey in 1980. Germany recognized the Yazidis of Turkey as a persecuted minority and welcomed them in numbers. Today, estimated Yazidi numbers in Germany vary from 60,000 to 120,000 people. Most Yazidi villages were destroyed in eastern and southeastern Turkey. Today, there are only a few Yazidi villages and few Yazidi remain in Turkey. Most standing Yazidi villages are located around the towns of Beşiri, Kurtalan, İdil, Nusaybin, and Viranşehir. Most Yazidi villages were occupied by the Muslims. The Yazidis who stayed in their villages lived together with their new Muslim neighbors. Some villages were forcefully evacuated in the 1990s, and deported population moved to the big towns and cities, and some of them joined their relatives in Germany. The main Yazidi pilgrimage center, the sanctuary of Sheikh Hadi at Lalish in northern Iraq, was converted into a madrasa after its capture by the Ottomans between 1809 and 1907. Apart from this exception, it is rare that Yazidi sacred spaces are converted to the need of the newcomers in any kind of country that they reside. Instead, Yazidi sacred places were targeted to destroy. The last worst destruction was realized by ISIL militants on the 3rd of August 2014. ISIL militants invaded Sinjar and northern Mosul, where most Yazidi population of Iraq lived and most Yazidi shrines were located. All the Yazidi shrines, mausoleums, tombstones, and houses were either razed or severely damaged. If we return to the cemetery of Hasanbeg in Nusaybin, where the Yazidis exhort to continue to exist and bond up their personal and cultural identity with their homelands, I believe it is noteworthy to draw attention to the meaning of the death and cemeteries for people in general. Death from a mythological and ritualistic perspective is not a static moment concerning the end of life, but rather as a dynamic momentum of creation and consumption of life by the community of the living. The death remains a fundamental source of inspiration and power for the living. Therefore, the moment of death is related not only to the process of the afterlife, but also to the process of living, aging, and producing progeny. Thus, the funeral rituals should be interpreted as a formal representation of an ideological performance that is practiced by the community of living beings. Funeral rituals materialize the memory of the deceased person, and the tomb stands as a focal point in the social and mnemonic landscape of the society. Cemeteries continue to tie the emotions of the living to the recently dead, and thereby connect the living in a chain of generations to an early ancestry. The construction of the funerary ritual itself is based on the creation of a symbolic language that is built upon different forms of communication by the group to which the individual dead belongs. Therefore, the elements of the material culture, such as the objects composing the funerary set, the dead body, the mythological stories, the religious beliefs, the songs, and the lamentations of the living, can express the need to transform a negative event, such as death, into a positive one. If we again return to the cemetery of Hasanbeg, it is located in the mountain at a remote spot from the villages surrounding it. According to Yazidis, Hasanbeg is believed to live between 1670 and 1736. His tomb is also believed to lie in the cemetery. People of Geliye Sora, Mezre, and Hanık in Nusaybin are buried in the cemetery. Moreover, inhabitants of the villages that were forcibly evacuated by the state in the 1990s, such as Evşe, also bury their departed in the cemetery. The cemetery of Hasanbeg is composed of two parts, ancient and new ones. Mausoleums and tombstones display features that represent the characteristic of the periods that they were built. It defines a range of stylistic attributes, provides styles of architecture and decorative arts. Yazidis' economic resources and stability in their new life in Germany also reflect in their graveyards. Yazidis built monumental tomb structures for their dead with the main signs and symbols of their religion in the new cemetery. The peacock is depicted as relief on the cut stones and metal sculptures. Heavenly and terrestrial depictions and Kurdish poems are also frequently used. Geometrical, floral, and stylized vegetal motifs were also used to decorate and symbolize the tombs. In the cemetery, even the most ordinary Yazidis tombstone is constructed elegantly and represent high artisanal skills. This can be considered as efforts to reconstruct and reclaim their heritage to sustain their practices and rituals in their lost homelands. The Yazidis consider their homeland sacred as it belongs to their mother, father, and ancestors, whose graves also lie there. According to them, every Yazidi should return to their lands one day. Therefore, they do not want to leave their dead in Europe. Moreover, for the Yazidis, constructing burial places, burying their dead their lands, and performing religious practices there mean also an act of resistance and resilience against the forces that uprooted them from their lands, and they had to become immigrants in foreign countries. In other words, the creation of memory places supports their society to continue and a symbol of resistance in their homelands. Today, no Yazidi cultural and religious heritage sites remain in eastern and southeastern Turkey. All Yazidi sacred spaces were destroyed. So there are no heritage sites in their lands that the Yazidis of Turkey could worship, perform their religious rituals, practices, and ceremonies, which means the loss of their culture, identity, and even extinction of the Yazidi community. Yazidism is a religion of orthopraxy. Thus, participation in religious rituals and adherence to specific behaviors are more important than the role of scriptural texts and dogma. Therefore, the practice of various religious festivals and pilgrimages are important for Yazidi identity. The religion cannot survive without these rituals, and the rituals cannot exist without the sites in which they are practiced. Thus, the sites of memory are the most powerful visible emblems, which unify all the activities of the separate groups of the Yazidi community and reconstruction of heritage and identity. This cemetery functions for the Yazidi community as both a worship place and motherland, where they believe to connect the divine, their ancestors, and each other. They pray there, visit their relatives and ancestors' tombstones, make commemorative wishes, perform religious ceremonies, recite hymns and lamentations, sacrifice animals, eat commemorative meals, and meet each other. Thus, cemeteries are considered to bind the past and the future, where Yazidi tradition and culture are transmitted to the new generation. It is also the place of memory, which plays a significant role in the production of power, domination, resistance, and existence. To conclude, Yazidis who left their homelands from the 1960s buried their dead in Germany, but with the little stabilization of the region, they began to bring their departed to their homeland and buried them in their ancestors' cemeteries. The cemetery of Hasan Bey is one of these cemeteries. For many Yazidis, the memories of homeland continue to carry personal meanings. And as they cannot still return to their homelands because of the political instability of the region and hostility, they continue to manifest their existence in their lands by burying their deceased and carrying out their commemorative rituals there. Inhumation is not an individual act, but a social phenomenon. When a departed is buried in a grave, it becomes a sign of existence of the dead community on the land of the grave. Therefore, graves and cemeteries constructed for the dead people also symbolize and point out the life and existence of their community on the land. People use this symbol to exist and to escape from extinction. Thus, one of the policies of the authorities is to clear away the graveyards or not let to bury their death of the communities which the authorities want to root out. Those in power use every possible special production at their proposal to erase or contain undesirable popular memories or subaltern pasts, preventing them from leaving any trace on the place. It becomes necessary for people to have a life with dignity. They have to bury their dead with honor. As it is, an exiled and deterritorialized community compensate for this lack by burying their dead in their homelands. It is also a hope for them to return there one day. So it also means a preparation of the return. Therefore, cemeteries mean for Yazidi community not only past and today, but it also means the future. And more importantly, it is a claim of their existence on those lands. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Açakyıldız. This was, as I said, a sad session.
Sorry, sad station.
Yeah. So I will wrap up the session. We will have some time to discuss the issues that were touched upon in all 4 papers. I will only briefly mention the complaint coming from everybody who listened for being unable to see the PowerPoint of Dr. Al-Jalur. None of the beautiful pictures were shown actually. And we have so far just one question from Professor Molly Green to also Dr. Al-Jalur. She's asking if you could confirm that the low doors of the churches were deliberately low in order for the congregants to bend down as they entered the church and to encourage humble attitude. Could he please confirm that?
Okay, thank you for the note about the complaints regarding the slideshow. Firstly, I had thought that I was sharing it, and I thought that if people couldn't see it, then maybe the moderator would speak over me and sort of alert me that nobody could see the slides, but unfortunately you didn't do that. I'd be happy to share my photographs with anybody that would like to see them, or at least the PowerPoint that I prepared. So as to Molly Green's question, so yes, it's correct. I couldn't actually explain everything because of the time constraints. In general, yes, doors were built very low and narrow so that people would bend so that they could enter the church and pay reverence to the divine presence inside. But also they were built deliberately low as a deterrent to vandals. So as a deterrent to people who would want to put animals in the church or ride into the church with their horses and thereby desecrate it. So that was also a double meaning for the low doors. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Jalou. No, oops, sorry. No, just thanks both from Professor Molly Green, and there is also a big thanks for the presentation of Dr. Achakildes. So, no, since there are no other questions, I tried to give precedence to our audience. I will give a few thoughts that all four presentations triggered with me. I must say that I was seeing quite a few parallels with the Balkans, although the Balkans have their specifics. But since all four papers actually touched upon violence, in a way, political violence, because in this case, the abandoned spaces, the abandoned religious places and heritage was triggered, the abandoning was triggered not just by the usual migration and leaving behind places, not just by the modernization of the habitat structure, which also in many places led to destruction of important monuments, but was to a great extent triggered by political moves, dramatic events at the beginning of the 20th century, primarily, both for the Orthodox Christians, for Armenians, and for the Assyrians. As for the Yazidis, they seem to have been the usual prey to political persecution and religious persecution. So a very long process of pressure. I will not continue with the summarizing, but I have a few questions which are more to satisfy my, let's say, curiosity. And triggered by the Balkan experience. First of all, the questions, three of the speakers spoke about the treasure hunting. As far as I can see, although the first two mentioned particularly the Armenian churches or the Armenian treasure hunting, it looks like that the Assyrians were also the prey for that interest, unhealthy interest, and all three seem to be in the opinion that there was no great success in finding treasures. In Bulgaria in particular, the treasure hunting is usually related to the ancient tombs, I mean, the ancient, really ancient, but there is also a market for Ottoman maps, and it's not so much about Christian monuments, but it's particularly about fortresses and about Haridudeshkia treasures, sometimes, but rarely about mosques or other religious places. Muslim religious places. So I'm not asking question, it's apparently a common feature of our region, but it's interesting to see how the different situation produces different focuses of interest for treasure hunting. One remark for Dr. Dinler, my feeling is that Banya or Payana church might very well translate as Panagia, that is Our Lady or the Mother God church. Banya doesn't look very plausible name for a church, but I mean, you may know better than me. Panagia is a traditional name for a Greek church. And I have a question for Dr. Algelu. I mean, you expressed interest that some collaboration with the better established churches of Syriac Orthodox and the Chaldean Catholics may help the Assyrians, but in the light of the Mor Gabriel case and of other monasteries related to these churches, do you think that there is any hope?
Okay, should I start first or should Professor Dindler start?
Well,
okay, well, I'm happy to go ahead. In the light of what's happening with Mor Gabriel, apparently a lot of the lands that had been confiscated have been returned, and there are still a few outstanding cases that they're working on. I've recently been in contact with one of the lawyers for the Mor Gabriel Foundation, and he told me that they're very active in trying to, you know, repossess these lands. But I mean, in general, actual church buildings are less of an issue than agricultural lands. So I think no one was actually trying to confiscate Mor Gabriel Monastery's buildings per se, because they're quite well known as being the property of the monastery. However, the agricultural lands, which had been passively owned by the monastery over centuries, became fair game because of the whole cadastral work that's been happening in the area for the last 20 years. And I think even some of it was incorrectly registered as forest land. So that's a little bit different. A lot of the churches in Hakkari, for instance, are visibly there. The structures are there, or the foundations are there. And the actual parcel is registered as belonging to Maliyet Hazinesi, so as belonging to the actual Treasury Republic of Turkey. So the situation is a little bit different. And if they were to want to act as guarantors for these structures, it could possibly work.
Inshallah, as they say. And I mean, I think all three of the first speakers spoke about possible motivation with tourism for the preservation of the monuments. Do you think that the municipalities are actually interested in developing this type of tourism? I mean, I remember seeing in Kayseri, in the middle of Kayseri, a huge Armenian church, which was actually guarded by an Armenian who resettled back in Turkey. That was, well, 10 years ago that I saw it, but he was very careful not to let random visitors, because he was afraid of these random visitors. So I had to identify myself as someone coming from a Christian background to be let in. So, I mean, I have very limited experience with such monuments, have visited quite a few, but not very much in this. But do you think that there is such an interest in developing this type of tourism?
I'm not sure if the question was for me or for everybody.
For all three first speakers, and I have one for Professor Çakıldız as well.
Okay, I'll just quickly say that, for instance, right now, and for the past nearly 1 year, about 11 months, I've been a guest of the Mar Hurmuzd Chaldean Catholic Church in Mardin. So I've been staying in a guest house at the church, which is actually located on the main street of Mardin. And you would be surprised at the people that come in and visit just straight off the main street. And, you know, there are days where you have somebody actually sitting outside the church and allowing people to come in. Obviously, there isn't much of a Chaldean congregation left in Mardin. There's only about 8 individuals, or 8 to 10 individuals. And this sort of supplements the support and the upkeep of the church building. So they're quite respectful. I've sort of watched them as they come in off the main street, and they're very respectful. And, you know, they don't say anything mean, and they're mostly Muslims. Not barely any of them are Christians, and there's no problem. But I think that's also part of the tourist image of Mardin as well. So when people think of Mardin, they think of, you know, different cultures and religions living side by side, and, you know, this sort of respect towards each other. So there isn't really a problem there. I was once visiting Konya, and I was visiting a Catholic church in Konya, and my experience was a little bit different. You had young Islamic fanatics basically attacking the poor nun that was guiding them around, telling them their gospel was not the true gospel, and saying really nasty things like that. So I guess it's different wherever in Turkey you are. It's not the same. You couldn't really put Mardin and Kayseri sort of on the same level when it comes to the kind of people that would be visiting these structures. But when it comes to Hakkari and Şırnak and Van and these sort of areas, I think many people actually accept the past and are welcoming to people who belong to groups that used to live in that area. So I think helping to reconstruct these churches or restore them or preserve them would go a long way in creating more dialogue and reconciliation between, you know, Turks, Kurds, Assyrians, Armenians, different groups that lived in that area. And I think it would be something very beautiful, and it would be accepted by the locals. I don't think there'd be a problem.
In Turkey, the first motivation for municipalities to restore churches and synagogues are tourism coming first. They want to wait for tourists to visit them. So the first motivation is not that these places are holy places or worship places, because we noticed that they never converted to in their real function as a worship place. But they are sometimes it's culturally converted into museums. This is a lucky way, but mostly it is used in order out of its function, like restaurants or another places like this.
Thank you. And I have Mr. Güden, do you have anything to add on? No? Okay, thank you. And that now we turn to Ezidis. I first have to apologize. Apparently, during the translation process, the Ezidi were mispronounced as Yezidi, which
doesn't matter.
Yeah, we have one remark also on our chat line that this is very much loaded with negative connotations. So I apologize on behalf of the translators. So I think we can skip that. And then my question that arose from your presentation, by the way, several congrats on our line for the presentation on Ezidis. You spoke about one particular cemetery. Are there others?
Yeah,
Because obviously, since there are no other places of worship, obviously the cemeteries have turned into holy places of all features, I mean, combining all features. How do the Turkish authorities view this return to, and you also mentioned something about purchasing or returning to the old houses. How is this viewed by the authorities, which I gathered from your presentations were not terribly happy with this community?
Actually, maybe they weren't happy in the past, but today, because there is no problem and no risk coming from this community, so there is no problem. Actually, now because of this political situation, that Yazidis can't return because they are scared. Simply, they are scared to come to be massacred again or have problems with their neighbors. Otherwise, in this peace process in the 20s, people came and they constructed houses, and they were coming and spending their summer holidays in their villages without any problem. But now they are not coming because they are scared. Otherwise, there's no problem. The authority doesn't show any hostility towards them. So they can come, they can visit their places. They even bring their departures from Europe without any problem. So there's a permission. They come and they go. But to leave, they don't. Actually, most of the old generation who moved to Germany or other countries in Europe, they regret to go there. They want to come back, but now it is too late for them and for their children as well, because there is a new generation who were born there and grew up with new culture, and it's difficult for them to come. But still, for the old generation, this is a hope that they will come back one day and they will continue their culture in their homelands.
Well, thank you. That's always the sad story of diaspora and coming and going between two worlds, actually different worlds. So, and anyway, that region that was covered by 3 of the papers is one of the most difficult ones. Very difficult to access, very difficult for different reasons, but I can understand the reluctance of returning home on security reasons in particular. Well, since I don't see any further questions, and I think we can actually close down on time the session just before the lecture of Professor Jamal Kafadar. But before that, I want to remind the participants to, if they wish to register for ADİP forum for your discussions and contributions at adipanadolu.org. Thank you for this extremely interesting session for someone coming from the Balkans with similar problems, similar processes, not entirely identical, but great similarity in the region. Thank you so much for the interesting presentations.